I like to start these things with an example, so let's dive right in. A few months ago, cognitive scientist Iris Van Roy asked for advice on Twitter as to how she can compress what was supposed to be a 45-minute talk in just 10 minutes. Well, some of the responses humorously suggested that rather than reducing the amount of information in her talk, she should merely speak faster at a rate of 4 to 5 times higher, or even have two different speakers present different sections of the talk at the same time at twice the speed. Now, joking aside, most of you have probably had this experience, hopefully not today, of sitting in a conference room, listening to a talk and to a speaker who goes way too fast for you to comprehend all of the information that they were trying to convey. This problem gets particularly bad if you're less familiar with the content area, with the terms and the jargon, or if the talk is not presented in your native language. So what these examples illustrate is a very well known fact about human cognition, namely that we people can only process a limited amount of information at any given time. Well, obviously, psychologists have been interested in the mechanism behind this limitation for a very long time, and a number of theories have emerged over the years to explain it. These include the idea that information decays over time unless it's refreshed, that when you have to maintain multiple representations active in the same mind, that causes them to interfere with each other, or finally, that performing cognitive operations requires some kind of a limited fuel, a limited cognitive resource. Today I'm going to focus on this third idea of a limited resource. This idea is very old, and as with any old idea, it has multiple different formulations. The resource in question has been conceived as having limits on the amount of activation that can be present in a memory network, as limits on the ability to control attention, as limits on the number of slots for maintaining representations in working memory, or finally as some unknown abstract quantity or a type of fuel that gets depleted with each cognitive operation. Despite these differences, there are a number of key features that are shared between all of these theories. Namely, it's assumed that some type of either psychological or a physiological quantity that is limited in nature is used to fuel most cognitive operations, whether that be memorizing the face or the name of someone you've just met, or calculating the outcome of an algebraic equation. Importantly, since this quantity is considered to be limited, using it up for performing one process leaves less of this resource available for performing additional processes at the same time. And finally, it's assumed that the more resources you dedicate to a particular process, the more likely it is that that process will be successful and it will be performed more efficiently. In addition to these three features, there's a feature shared by most, although not all, of these resource-based theories. And that is the idea that once you complete a cognitive operation, the resource that you attributed to it immediately becomes available for performing additional operations. Just as an example of that idea is that in slot-based theories of working memory, if you have to remember a phone number, you attribute each digit to a different slot until you can find a piece of paper or your phone to write it down. And the moment you write it down, this information is irrelevant, the slots are emptied, and now you can store additional information there. So today I'm going to focus on this assumption and challenge it. Particularly, I said that this is true of most current models of memory, but not true of all of them, and particularly the SAC model of memory that Lynne has developed over the past 2 decades deviates from that assumption and states that rather than becoming immediately available for use, resources take a certain amount of time to gradually recover before they are available for use. Now, as a simple analogy to the things I've said so far, you could consider any physical activity, either that be running or lifting weights. In order for muscles to contract, they use up a fuel, a molecule called ATP that generates over time. And the higher the intensity, the more of that molecule is required. But importantly, the moment you cease an activity, not all of that resource become available. You have a certain amount of fatigue, and it takes time for your body to recover before it's possible to do that activity again. Well, the claim that I'm going to make in this presentation today is that memory operates in a similar way. So the central goal of this dissertation project has been to comprehensively test this assumption that storing information in long-term memory first depletes a limited resource, and second, that that resource gradually recovers over time. Now, this assumption might seem obvious to some of you, but as I said, most models assume that that's not true, and it's a controversial claim as exampled by this quote by one of the most prominent current researchers in the field. So in order to test this claim, my dissertation has focused on three different parts. First, I will introduce our revised version of the SAC model, and I will show that due to the resource depletion and recovery assumption, the model can provide a comprehensive explanation for a set of what were previously considered puzzling empirical findings. Second, because of these assumptions, the model can make a number of novel specific assumptions, novel specific predictions concerning the order of items during a study list. And finally, I will look at what happens when there are no sufficient resources to store information in memory. So let's begin with the first part. Consider the following two words, chair and rogue. These words differ obviously in many different ways, but one of the most prominent ways in which they differ, unless you're an avid fantasy reader, chair appears much more frequently in written and spoken language than the word rogue. If I were to ask you today to study a list of words and these two are present in the list, which of them do you think you're most likely to remember? Well, it turns out that this is a fairly complicated question, and memory researchers have been interested in the effect of word frequency for decades because it actually has very puzzling and diverse effects. Word frequency can either benefit or impair memory depending on a number of different conditions of the paradigm. Over the last few decades, we've discovered that word frequency can benefit memory if you test it by way of recall, but impairs memory if the type of test is a recognition test. The word frequency effects usually appear if the list contains only high or only low frequency items, but if you mix them together, the effect either reverses or disappears. This effect also depends on the order of high and low frequency items in a list. It changes as you change the presentation rate for each word. It increases over serial positions and usually increases as you increase the overall memory load. Now, this is a very small subset of the word frequency findings, and we've done a systematic literature review. You don't have to read all of that, but just as an illustration of how many different findings concerning word frequency there exist. And the first major puzzle is, what is the mechanism that leads to these diverse effects of word frequency in memory? Well, when you talk about mechanisms, Lynne and my approach is to consider a computational model that you can implement and run and see whether it replicates behavioral findings. So I'm going to introduce now our revised version of the source of activation confusion memory model. In order to explain all of the findings that I just briefly presented, the model relies on several assumptions. First, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, our model claims that when you store information in memory or when you have to bind features of stimuli together, these operations deplete a limited pool of working memory resources. And each operation depletes a different proportion of the working memory resource pool, and this pool in turns recovers gradually over time. The most important point here is that the default cost of a cognitive process depends on the strength of the representation of information in long-term memory. High-frequency words have stronger representations because they're experienced more frequently, and they require less resources for processing, and vice versa with weaker representations. And as a result of the previous three assumptions, when you have to maintain or process less familiar, weaker chunks of information, you have less working memory resources available for processing additional stimuli. And as a final assumption, when you retrieve information in memory, if the queue you use have many different associations, the queue is less effective in retrieving any one of those associations. So I said about stimulus strength and the strength of representations in memory. How does SAC represent information in memory? Well, SAC is an associative memory network that includes different types of information nodes. It has semantic nodes that represent concepts such as apple and chair that you study in a list. It has context nodes that represent the experiential context, the room, the temperature, your internal mood. And it has episodic memory nodes that bind all of this information together and represent that these different pieces have been experienced at the same time. I mentioned that these nodes differ in terms of strength as a function of prior exposure. Well, the model distinguishes between two different types of strength: the prior strength of nodes in memory that people come into the lab with, and how that strength changes as a function of experimental conditions. Thus, when it comes to the pre-existing base level strength, we assume that this is a function of the prior frequency of exposure, such that the strength of these nodes increases as a power function of prior word frequency. When people come into the lab and we ask them to study a list of words, each of those nodes would become incremented, the strength would become incremented, but it will also decay over time according to these two equations. Just as a simple illustration, imagine you're studying the same word 5 times. Initially, it gets strengthened to this value, then before you experience it again, that strength decays over time, and once you experience it again, that strength increases by a certain increment and proportion. The major thing to notice here that the stronger the base level strength is, the less it's incremented over time. So stronger stimuli require less of a boost to be learned. I mentioned earlier that one of the assumptions is that how much working memory resources memory operation depletes depends on the current strength of nodes in memory. Well, how do we implement that in the model? Well, first, the model assumes that there's some total capacity of resources that you have available for encoding information, Wmax, and that each cognitive process has a default cost that is a function of how much that process is strengthened. So this is the increment equation that we have for the base level strength, and in the model assumes that the default cost of a process is a exponential function of that cost, so of that increment. So the more something is incremented, the greater the resource cost is of memory. And finally, the model assumes that this capacity recovers as a linear function of time since the last operation. It's just a simple example of how that works out in an actual experiment. Imagine you study this list of words. The words in red are low frequency and require more increments. The words in blue are high frequency and require less of an increment. And on this graphic, I'm showing the amount of available resources at the beginning and end of each trial as a function of the study position. And we can see that in the beginning, you have your total capacity. And once you encode a weak item, this capacity decreases, but then recovers over time by the time the next item is presented, and so on and so forth. And we see that if we have a sequence of strong items, the resource is depleted less because it has sufficient time to recover after each, and vice versa. This is all about how study procedures work in the model. Information in the model is retrieved depending on the type of test in several different ways. during retrieval, depending on whether it's item recognition, associative recognition tests, and so forth, several cues in memories are activated. In an item recognition test, this is the actual item that you have to recognize and the context in which it's activated. And activation is spread to their binding episodic nodes. And if that node reaches a certain retrieval threshold, people can make a judgment whether they've seen that item on the list. And the same for a recall task. If the strength is sufficient, people can retrieve it from memory. So this is a computational model, and it's a process model such that for all the simulations that I'm gonna show later, we actually take the actual study trials that were presented to people in an experiment and give them to the model to perform as if the model is an actual human. The model performs a task and outputs activations values for each trial, and then we transform these activation trials into recognition and recall probabilities and fit the model to the actual data. Now, as part of this stage, I'm not going to go over all of the simulations because I want to get to the new interesting data, but we fit 18 simulations of existing data. And one of the things we've discovered that the recovery rate is fairly consistent over all of the studies we've discovered, such that we've estimated that it takes between about 3 and 12 seconds for working memory resources to recover completely from the lost encoding operation, with an average of about 5 seconds. So just as an illustration, I know there are a lot of figures here. The goal is not to walk you through all of that, but to show you the wide range of findings that we've gone over in the literature. And in all of these plots, you can see both existing data and the fit of the model. And on the left, we have a summary of the findings that I already mentioned in the beginning. So the model performs surprisingly well in fitting a wide range of what were previously considered puzzling empirical findings, and provides comprehensive explanations for why word frequency sometimes benefits memory, sometimes hurts memory, and how it interacts with other variables. And the surprising finding from all of this is that these resources take about 5.3 seconds to recover. So one note to mention here is that whether we would find these effects obviously depends on the presentation rate used in these studies, which is important for trying to replicate these findings. Okay, so I've gone on with this quickly, but the model performs very well in fitting existing data, but the hallmark of testing new models is not whether they can fit existing data, but whether they can make novel predictions that other models can't, and whether those predictions are confirmed by new experiments or reanalysis of data. I call all of the findings that I'm going to present in a bit sequential study effects, because the assumption that resources recover gradually over time and do not become immediately available means that if at one point in time during study you deplete more resources, then you have less resources available for encoding information in the nearby future. As an example of all the analysis that I'm going to present in a moment, imagine you study a sequence of items as represented here, where N shows, K shows the study position of the items in the sequence. And in all of the following analysis, I will be looking at memory for a specific item, let's say xk, as a function of how much resources have been depleted by the preceding items. This model can make several different predictions concerning the sequence of these items. Well, first, we expect that memory for item xk would be significantly better if the preceding item xk-1 is a high frequency rather than a low frequency item, because it will deplete less resources and it will leave more resources available for processing the current item. Second, we expect that this will not be just a discrete function of whether it's high or low frequency, but it will depend continuously on the frequency of the preceding item. The higher the frequency of the preceding item, the better memory for the following item should be. We also expect that there should be a cumulative effect such that memory will depend not only on the immediately preceding items, but if you have more low frequency items in a sequence, even more resources would be depleted and memory for the current item would become even worse. So there will be a cumulative effect. We also expect that there would be an interaction between the strength of the preceding and the current item. So if the current item is low frequency, it will require even more resources than if it's high frequency. And that would mean that the impairment based on previous items would be even bigger. And finally, we would also expect an interaction between the frequency of the preceding items and how many steps in the path we look at. So the effect of the immediately preceding item should be strongest, but the effect of the item's 2 positions back in the sequence would be a little weaker because there would have been more time for resources to recover in the meantime, and etc. as we go further back in the sequence. And finally, the 6th assumption that wasn't present in my dissertation proposal, but we found evidence so far since, is that all of these effects should also interact with the speed with which items are presented, such that if we speed up the presentation rate, resources would have less time to recover, so the effects of preceding item strength should increase as well. We tested these predictions in 9 different studies, including the 6th prediction now in a total of 10. And even though so far I spoke about word frequency per se, these effects actually should occur with any variable that affects how much resources are depleted by studying the item. The most obvious is word frequency, and we've looked at four different existing studies as a function either of a discrete word frequency or continuous. But this effect should also occur if you experimentally change the frequency of items by training them at different exposure frequencies prior to the experiment. We should also expect that if you repeat an item multiple times in the experiment, each time you present it, it should deplete less resources than items that follow it should have better memory. And finally, we've performed 2 experiments saying that if you give instructions for each item, whether it should be remembered or forgotten, we expect people that will spend more resources trying to remember the items that we tell them to remember. So memory should be worse following to be remembered rather than to be forgotten items. As a quick overview, I will show some of the data as well. We found overwhelming support for these 5 predictions in the majority of these studies. And we have also performed a meta-analysis showing that each of these 5 predictions is supported by all of the studies taken together. It's important to note here that even though I'm talking about past studies, all of these analyses are novel, and I'm very grateful to the researchers who shared their data with us that allowed us to perform these analyses. As an example of that, because it might sound too abstract so far, this is a study that was performed by Rachel, Diana, and Lynne in 2006. In which they asked people to study a sequence of trials, where on each trial people saw an image and a word superimposed on that image. In this study, they manipulated the frequency of the word, and then they tested memory for the picture. In the original study, they found that when the word is high frequency, memory for the picture was better than if the word was low frequency. And they argued that high frequency words leave more resources for studying the item. The novel analysis that I'm going to look at here is whether memory for this picture depends instead on frequency of the preceding word. So on the plot here, I'm going to show on the x-axis frequency of the current item, so the current word. And with red and blue, I will show bars, so the preceding word, whether it was high or low frequency. So the main effect that we can see when the current item is of low frequency, we see that memory was better if the preceding item was high frequency rather than low frequency. So this is exactly what I said in the prediction, 2 predictions in the beginning. Memory for the current item is better if the preceding item is high frequency, and there's an interaction between the 2 effects such that the effect is greater when the current item is low frequency instead. Now, I mentioned the analysis of lag. If we look further back in the sequence, the effect should decrease with each study position. And if we focus on the current low frequency item, and we now condition this on how many steps back in the past we're looking at, the effect is strongest when we're looking at the immediately preceding item, lag 1, followed smaller effect at lag 2, and a non-existing effect of lag 3. Now, I'm not going to go through, the other assumption that I mentioned, that there should also be a cumulative effect, such that the more low high frequency items in a list you have, the greater the effect should be. So on this figure on the x-axis, I'm showing the number of low or high frequency items in a sequence. On this end, we have 4 low frequency items in a sequence. On this end, we have 4 high frequency items in a sequence. And we see that memory for the current item improves as we move from many low frequency to many high frequency items in a sequence, which is exactly what is predicted by the model. And this line shows the fit of the model as well. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the studies here, but suffice to say that all of the effects that I just showed you in the Diana and Reder paper that we've discovered, we've replicated in all of these other studies. I'll show a couple of other examples for the predictions that I haven't mentioned. So next, we can look at the continuous effect of prior item strength. Okay, so we've looked at a major study by Gregory Cox et al. From a couple of years ago, where they asked a huge number of participants, 400, to perform 4 different memory tasks in which people studied a list of word pairs without knowing the kind of test that will appear. In a test, they asked them to do either an item recognition, associative recognition, free recall, or queued recall. And again, we looked at memory for 1 word pair, depending on the continuous frequency, average frequency of the preceding pair. And it's important to show that this effect appears, whether it varies by task, because that happens to the regular frequency effect. So here, the different panels represent the different memory tasks. And on the top, we will have hit rate or recall probability. On the bottom, we'll have response time. And the x-axis shows the average log frequency of the preceding item pair during study. The red data is the actual observed data, and the blue data is the fit of the model. So we see that across all of these memory tasks, memory for the current item is better if the preceding item is of higher frequency as a continuous function. And this appears across all of the different testing tasks. And we also show that the same effect happens in reaction time, such as even when you do happen to recognize the item, you are faster when the preceding item was of higher frequency. Importantly, the effect also interacts with lag. So the 3 different slopes of the effect here are for the immediately preceding item, the one at lag 2 and the one at lag 3. And we see that the slope of this effect decreases as you move farther in time. And we have the actual data and the simulation of the model on the right. We've replicated this effect again in another free recall study as well. And finally, I'm going to show a brief data of 2 experiments that we actually performed based on directed forgetting. So in the directed forgetting task, you see a sequence of items, and after each item, you see a cue, whether you're supposed to remember to BR the preceding item, or you're supposed to forget it to be forgotten. And I'm going to look at memory for item xk as a function of the queue to the preceding item. The assumption is that to be remembered items would deplete more resources and would hurt memory for the current item. So this is exactly what we found. This is queued recall performance on the right as a function of the current as a queue. Obviously, to be remembered items have better memory. But the reverse effect happens if we look at the queue for the preceding item, such as if the preceding item was to be remembered, which is the triangle data, memory for the current item is worse. And we have a very excellent fit of the model, both to the queued recall and to the free recall data. As well, there's again a cumulative effect, such that if you have more to be remembered items in a sequence, memory for the current item suffers. And we've replicated this effect in another study. And at this point, you could ask, well, maybe it's not about resource depletion. Maybe people direct their attention backwards to rehearse to be remembered items. So in order to exclude this possible explanation, we asked people to do a divided attention task in which they either did the memory task on its own, or we asked them to do at the same time a parity task where they have to judge the oddness or evenness of digits presented concurrently, or we asked them to suppress recursion or both at the same time. So if the alternative explanation is true, that people direct attention backwards to the sequence, then when we divide attention and we prevent that possibility, the effects should disappear. Well, this is not what we found. So here on this figure, we can see that, so memory for the current item is worse if the preceding item is to be remembered, which is the triangle data, and that happens in all conditions that we tested: control, divided attention, rehearsal, suppression, and both, in both the acute recall and free recall task. We also saw that, as in the previous study, we have a cumulative effect of the number of preceding items, whether to be forgotten or to be remembered. And we also saw the effect of lag that I mentioned for word frequency as well, such as the biggest effect is when we look at the cue for the immediately preceding item, and the effect decreases over time. And you as well, again, can see the fit of the model, which replicates the data very well. So it's kind of a summary of all of that. We found overwhelming support for all of the predictions, and I've shown you examples of some of that data, although definitely not all of those. I mentioned the sixth assumption that wasn't present in my dissertation proposal, that since we found data in support of it, that these effects should interact with presentation rate. So we went back to one of the studies I mentioned, which is Pierce's very large-scale multi-session experiment of free recall with a lot of data. In this particular task, people were asked to study items one at a time. Each item was presented for 300 milliseconds, but importantly, the stimulus interval between items varied randomly, uniformly between 800 and 1200 milliseconds. Now, we can make several predictions based on the model for these data. Namely, first, that memory for this item, let's say 3, should be better when the preceding interval is longer, which will allow more resources to recover during that time. The second prediction is that, as we saw, memory for this varies as the frequency of the preceding item, and this effect should decrease as we increase the interstimulus interval, because again, resources would be able to recover over time. So here, this is a plot that I already showed in this experiment. So this is the frequency of the preceding item. This is recall probability for the current item. And we see memory is better when the preceding item is high frequency. Now, if we look at memory for the current item as a function of the size of the preceding interval, which is on the x-axis, we see that recall is more likely for the current item the larger that interval is, as predicted by the model. Now, I predicted that these two effects should interact with each other. So if we look at the slope as a measure of the effect size of the preceding item frequency, as we increase the interval between items, this slope should decrease more and more as that interval changes. And this is exactly what we found. So this is the same data as on the previous plot, but now the different colored lines represent the different intervals. It's a little difficult to see on the first plot, but we can center the line on the y-axis to be able to compare the slopes to one another. And we can see we have the largest slope for the shortest duration, and the slope decreases linearly as a function of that interval, which is exactly what the model predicted. So as a summary of the first part, we found overwhelming support for all 6 predictions of the model. And none of these predictions can be derived from existing models of memory. And this provides support that memory resources do recover over time. Finally, in the third aim, so far I present model can account for existing data and explain puzzling findings. I've showed you that it makes interesting novel predictions that were supported by novel experiments and novel reanalysis. If we accept the claim that memory resources recover over time, and we can ask the question, well, what happens to memory if you don't have sufficient resources to store a new item? Well, there are 2 different possibilities. One option is that if you don't have sufficient resources, you don't store anything in memory. You draw a blank, no memory trace is created. Alternatively, if you have some resources available, but less than the default amount of resources required, you might be able to create a memory that is weaker proportionally to whatever resources remain. At this point, if this was a live presentation, I would ask you which of these two things is more plausible, and usually overwhelmingly people choose the second option here. Lynne and I have argued at length which of those two is correct, so we decided to run experiments to determine this. So we had two goals in the following experiments. We want to dissociate whether word frequency affects either the probability of binding or the memory precision. And we also want to characterize with in-depth the effect of word frequency on source memory, which hasn't been done previously. And since we know word frequency varies by memory task, this was an important goal as well. So before I go into the details, I'll show you an example of the task we use because it makes it easier to understand the hypothesis afterwards. So the task we used is a source memory task where on each trial, people see a sequence of 5 words presented at different locations on an invisible circle. Each word was presented for a varying amount of time. And then after a short period, we show one of the words at random in the center of the screen, and people have to click on the circle where they remember seeing it during study. To give you an example of this task, look at the fixation cross right now, and you'll see an example trial. So you saw 5 words, and now you have to respond where pencil appeared on the screen. And you might say pencil showed up about here. And that will be your response. Well, in fact, pencil appeared to the left. And we can measure memory performance in this particular task not as a discrete quantity, whether you remembered or not, but as the angle difference between the retrieved location and the actual location. The closer you are to the actual location, the better your memory is of that item. Just to show you kind of what the cool data looks like, this is a plot of all 3,000 trials we asked 160 participants to do. And when you plot that as a distribution of the angle error, you see a distribution that looks like this, with most of the responses centered around the actual location and a number of error bumps at different locations in the task. So you might ask, why do we have these bumps at these different locations? Well, if you remember, we presented 5 words on the screen. So these 4 different bumps would represent situations in which people failed to recall the actual location of the tested word, but remembered one of the other locations and they guessed at that point. So what does all of that have to do with the question that I asked in the beginning about resource depletion? Well, when you get a distribution like that in this task, you can apply something called a mixture model to dissociate what causes people to make an error. And you can derive 3 different parameters. First, people might make a correct response. They remember where the correct location is, but they remember it with different precision. So depending on how precise their memory is, they'll respond somewhere around that location, and we measure the precision of the memory as the standard deviation of that distribution. Then it's possible that people guess completely at random, in which case there would be no systematicity in the responses. And if you look at the gray bar, this represents a uniform distribution across all possible locations. And finally, people might have stored some information in memory, but they failed to retrieve the binding between the word and the location, and retrieve one of the other locations instead, and they respond with one of the non-probed location, which causes them to make a bump in one of these different distributions. And then we can fit, using maximum likelihood, we can fit a mixture model to each individual trial to derive these different parameters and test how different variables affect different parameters of the model. Okay, so what does that have to do with resource depletion and word frequency? Well, based on the 2 hypotheses that I presented, we can make 2 different predictions about how word frequency will affect parameters in the model. So first, let's assume that when you encode many low frequency words, you run out of resources and you fail to create memory traces for some of them, then we would expect that if you don't have any information stored in memory, this should decrease the amount of correct responses and would increase the amount of misbinding error or guesses, but would have no effect on the precision of the memory traces because you have no information stored in memory. Alternatively, if you still store a weaker memory trace that is less precise for low frequency items, we should see that there shouldn't be an effect of the relative proportion of the different distributions, but we should see an increase in the standard deviation or a decrease in the precision for low frequency words. So we've tested these two hypotheses in 3 different experiments. We asked each participant to do 300 different trials, as the one I presented below. And we manipulated word frequency, the serial position of the probe, the presentation rate, and whether the list was only low or high frequency words or whether these were mixed together. And we progressively added more of these independent variables to the different experiments. Experiment 1 is the simplest, which is a proof of concept that only varied word frequency. In experiment 2, we varied word frequency, but also how quickly, how long each word was presented. And finally, in experiment 3, we varied whether each trial contained 40 or 60% of low frequency words per trial. So there are a lot of results shown here. I'll split them in several parts. First, we can look at the main effect of word frequency. So here on the y-axis, before we get to the modeling aspects, I'll just show the raw absolute angle error. So higher values mean worse memory in this task. And on x-axis, we have word frequency. We can see that in experiment 1, which was lists of pure high and low frequency, we have better memory, so less error for high frequency words compared to low frequency words. And this is not about recalling the word itself, it's about recalling the associated location. So encoding high frequency words allowed better encoding of the location itself. And we replicated this in experiment 2 with almost the exact same effect size. If the additional change was varying the presentation rate in the experiment. So this is a function of categorical frequency, but we can also look at it as a function of continuous frequency, which is on the plot to the right. We see that as word frequency increases per million words, the error for the associated location decreases, and most of that effect is steepest at the lower end of the frequency range, and then it tapers off for high frequency words. Now, we can apply the mixture model and ask which of the parameters of the model word frequency affects. So these 4 panels would show the probability of correct responses, probability of guesses, probability of making a misbinding error, and the precision of the memory for the location. First, we see that in both experiment 1 and experiment 2, low frequency words were associated with less probability of recalling the correct location. And this was due primarily to increased misbinding errors for low frequency trials. So these are the cases where people recall one of the other locations. There was no difference in guessing parameters. And most importantly, there was no difference in the precision for once you do successfully recall the location for high and low frequency item. So the take-home message from the first part is that in pure lists, in source memory, we see that low frequency words lead to worse memory for the locations. And importantly, this is due to more misbinding errors for low frequency words rather than decrease precision. So if we go back to the initial hypothesis that I posed, this on the face of it would suggest that when you encode low frequency words and you run out of resources, it's more plausible that no memory trace is created because you fail to retrieve the binding rather than retrieving a less precise binding. But I'll get to limitations of that conclusions at the end. Now, in the second part, in experiment 2, we also manipulated a duration as well. So we should see the effects of word frequency to increase as the presentation speed up because of less ability to recover resources. So in experiment 2, on the x-axis here, I'll show the presentation rate and the angle error as a function. The different line would be high and low frequency. And we can see exactly what I suggested. So at the fastest presentation rate, we have a huge difference between high and low frequency words in recalling the location. And this effect decreases such that once we slow it down to 1 word per second, there is no significant difference between low and high frequency words. Now, we can't apply the model separately for the interaction because we don't have enough observations to make the parameters reliable, but we can apply the model just to the effect of duration. And we should see consistent effects between how duration affects the parameters versus word frequency, if both of these effects are due to the resource recovery assumption. And again, these are the 4 parameters of the model, and we see that the effect is entirely due to making less misbinding errors the more time you have to encode the difference between high and low frequency words, and there is no differences in memory precision between high and low frequency words. So these results supported the conclusions from experiment 1. One limitation of that is that we tested a narrow range of word presentation rates, and it's possible that if we decrease it even further, precision might suffer at those presentation rates as well. And finally, and I will conclude with that part, we also manipulated the list composition of the trials. So the list composition paradox is an effect known for a long time in other tasks, although it hasn't been tested in source memory tasks. And this is that the typical effect of word frequency disappears if you mix low and high frequency words together in the same list. Although some studies have shown that it disappears, other studies show that it reverses altogether, and it's not clear why that happens. But one hypothesis that we had that if the list composition paradox is due to the resource recovery assumption, then it should also depend on the presentation rate. So experiment 1 and 2 had only high and low frequency items on each trial, and experiment 3 would mix them together. And so on this figure, I will show you on the left we have high frequency items, on the right we have low frequency items. On the x-axis we have the presentation rate, and we have the pure list experiment and the mixed list experiment here. Well, first, this is the data that I showed you before, which shows that in the pure experiment, we have a main effect of word frequency, which disappears with presentation rate. Now, when we mix the 2 lists together, we see that the lines shift in opposite direction for high and low frequency item, such that now the main effect of word frequency, if we look at the intercept of these 2 lines, disappears. But it also depends on the presentation rate, such that if we slow it down, we lead to an actual reversal of the effect, leading to worse memory for high frequency items now instead. So this might be able to explain disparate effects in the literature. So as a kind of a summary of all these 3 parts of the final experiment, we found that worse source memory performance for low frequency words compared to high frequency words. And we found evidence from our mixture model that this is due to less probability of binding the word to the location rather than a decreasing memory precision, which could suggest that when you run out of resources for low frequency words, you fail to create a memory trace altogether. Now, there's a limitation with that conclusion, however, that some of you might have already recognized is the problem is that the mixture model that we apply necessarily operates on the retrieval data. So it is possible, so one alternative explanation to these data is that when you make a misbinding error, it's not that memory trace doesn't exist, it is that it's so weak that it fails to pass the retrieval threshold. So that argument would say that the precision that we measure of memory traces is necessarily the precision of traces that are strong enough to be retrieved and will not be affected by the precision of weaker memory traces. So there's no easy way to address this question with the current experiments we have, but as a first step, we could look at where the misbinding errors occur and whether there is some evidence that some information is stored. In order to do that, we looked at an effect that's familiar in the literature as a contiguity effect, in which the typical effect is that if you ask people to study a sequence of items in a free recall task, it's usually argued that they create associations between the different items and the current context. And then a test, if you ask them to recall one of these items, then they will retrieve these nearby associations and are more likely to retrieve items on nearby location, as shown in this curve here, where on the x-axis we have the lag between the current recalled item and the next recalled item, and you can see people are most likely to recall the immediately subsequent item, and that decreases on each side of the curve. This is typically taken as evidence that you create associations between the different items. There is no current experiment to show similar effects in a source memory task, so we've decided to explore this here. So as a reminder of the paradigm, people see 5 different words on the screen and they're probed in one word at test. Well, we ask the question here, so if they can't recall the location for this word, if they have stored at least some memory trace of that word, that memory trace might include information about the temporal context. And remember that it appeared somewhere in the beginning of the experiment. In that case, they might, when they make a misbinding error, they might be more likely to retrieve not any location at random, but the location of the words that were presented in nearby temporal positions. If that is the case, then we'll have evidence that at least some information was stored on trials for either low or high frequency words. So we looked at this, and here on the 5 different panels, I will show you when probing memory for the first, second, third, fourth, or the 5th item in memory. And we've applied the model to give us the probability that the response comes from each of the 5 different locations. And I'm going to plot on the x-axis what was the most probable source of the error. You'll see that when we test the first probe, obviously the most probable source is the first item, but then is the subsequent item in the list, and the probability falls off at some subsequent items. And the same can be observed for each tested location, where the most probable errors are to nearby temporal items. And if we combine all of these data and ignore the correct responses, we can see the typical lag curve that is seen in other memory tasks as well, such that the errors are more likely to come from nearby locations. So
I don't want to interrupt you, but you're starting to run over. So you're going to
slide is a conclusion.
Okay.
Thank you. So what this suggests, the combination of the previous results suggests that, well, even though for low frequency words, people might fail to retrieve the correct binding, some memory is stored, some information is stored in memory for those items. So with the current data, we can't necessarily tell which of our 2 original hypotheses are correct, but we have some evidence that when you run out of resources, at least you store some information. Well, I presented a lot of data, so let's summarize a bit. First, I showed that our revised version of the SAC model can provide a comprehensive modeling account of existing puzzling empirical findings as to why word frequency sometimes hurts, sometimes helps memory. Then I showed that the model makes 6 different novel predictions about the order of items during study, and showed support from 9 different experiments that there's support for this prediction. And finally, we looked at whether when you run out of resources, you fail to store any information in memory. And while the data is ambivalent, we have some support that memory information is still stored, and we might be able to resolve the list composition paradox. Well, I want to thank everyone first for the attention, but first I want to start with Lynne. Working with Lynne over these past 5 years have been extremely rewarding. I couldn't have asked for a better advisor. The way we work together allowed me to grow as a researcher, but also Lynne pushed me to become the best possible version of myself and to pursue these ideas with as much rigor as possible. I want to thank my committee, John Anderson, Marlene Behrmann, and Marc Coutanche for their insightful feedback and questions throughout this process, and for help with additional various projects. I want to thank the members of the various members of the Memory Lab over the past years who have helped with experimental coding, with running participants, with some of the analysis. I want to thank all of my co-authors on various papers, my friends and family for the support that they've provided over this time, and the Explorer Club of Pittsburgh, who have helped me kept sane with mountain adventures throughout this process. Thank you for the attention.
That's great, Ven. Some people may know how to do a thumbs up and clap, but that's the only downside I can see of this format, is you can't hear all the whistles and cheers that people are probably giving you. All right, at this point, what I'd like to do is ask the committee members to ask questions, then following that, other faculty who wish to ask questions, and then everyone else. And people, if we don't get to everybody's questions, when the committee members and interested faculty join me in another room, the rest of you can pound in with more questions. I'd like to begin with Marc. I don't see the people, and I suggest that you put on your video when you're asking questions so that everybody can see who you are. So go ahead, Marc.
Yeah, thanks, Ven. Fantastic presentation, as always. Just incredible set of work. Yeah, I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with one here. You mentioned towards the end of the dissertation that further work will go on to specify the form of the resource recovery function, and that you choose sort of a linear recovery rate. And I guess actually, now I think about it, I have kind of two related questions. One is, when you think about alternative recovery rates or forms of that function, what other possibilities could you see? And this may well be obviously is going to be for future research or future questions. So just ask you to sort of speculate or work in that area. And the second related thing is, I thought it was very interesting where you were also talking about how there can be multiple timescales, right? Like you're focusing on more immediate, but as you mentioned in the example in your dissertation, that we have just for muscle contraction, you can be tired at the end of the day compared to right immediately after exercising. So yeah, two very related questions. Just love to hear your thoughts generally on it.
Thanks for asking this question, because I'm particularly interested in pursuing that in the future. So when it comes to the first question, so in this particular case, we started with a linear recovery rate to see whether it's successful in modeling the data, and it is, but it's possible to conceive, so it will all, the nature of the recovery function will depend on what is actually the resource that's being used up on a physiological level. So we could imagine a different situation in which you have a power function of recovery, where you have initial quick recovery to supply you with additional resources for processing information close to the future, but then it tapers off and recovers more slowly as the amount of resources are saturated. And that kind of goes at the second question as well, whether there are different time scales. So as the example with the analogy and with the muscle fatigue, ATP molecules, even though are only one resource types, it can be generated by different mechanisms, aerobic, anaerobic, and another third set. And these different mechanisms depend on the intensity of the exercise and have different time scale about the speed with which the resource recovers. So it's very possible that something similar happens with the memory resource, either that it's you have different timescales and different mechanisms of recovery, or if you have a power function that could kind of summarize different time scales, where you have initial quick recovery that tapers off over time. But I did think that there are different time scales, mainly because we have a lot of data that working memory performance is not static as a function of time of day. Usually people perform best in the morning, then it tapers off in the afternoon, it goes back up, and it goes down, back down in the evening, following a typical circadian rhythm. And we also know that working memory resources decrease as people age. So that could be either as a reduction of total capacity or as a reduction in the speed with which resources recover.
Great, thank you. That's great.
Thank you. Lynn, I can't hear you.
You're muted, Lynn.
There we go. Oh, that's great, Mark. Any more questions from you? I guess he's now muted, so I assume no. All right.
Yeah, okay, I wasn't sure if we were going sort of around or, okay.
No, I think we're just going to do exhaustive for each person.
Okay, well, one, you know, and I'm grateful. I mean, one good thing, Ven, about being your committee is I've seen a lot of this excellent work before, and so I asked you a lot of questions before, but one question I will ask, and feel free to, you know, address this how you want. And so, you know, the ego depletion kind of work, you know, there are differences, as you mentioned in your dissertation, particularly around executive functioning, but nonetheless, it has an analogy to, you know, to what you're talking about. That said, the ego depletion kind of framework has been critiqued and questioned. So my sort of provocative or question to you, although I know there's an answer, is what gives you confidence that you're more robust, these sort of findings are more robust than, say, has been found for the different world, but parallel world of ego depletion? And that's really my last open abstract question. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I can address this question in two different ways. First, considering differences in experimental paradigm and why we think our is more robust, and second, to address the modeling as well. Also, the nature of the resources. So let's start with the last part. One of the big differences, so in the ego depletion literature, it's assumed that this amorphous resource is used for attentional control and for executive control and the ability to restrain from taking certain actions. So even though the idea that there's a resource that's depleted and recovers over time is very different for what it is used in the two different conceptions. In the ego depletion literature, sometimes it's conceived as only for attentional control, sometimes it's something general. In our examples, it's something very specific. It's a resource that is used to fuel memory operations. So when you have to create a binding between different items or increment an existing binding, you use up some proportion of that resources to fuel that operation. So that leads me also to the modeling aspect. So the ego depletion literature is mostly verbal theory. So people say there's the resources and you use it up and it recovers. And obviously there are nuances and there are more specific assumptions, but I personally haven't seen anything specifically implemented into a mechanistic computational model, which is exactly what is different here. We have an existing framework and model of memory to which you can attach these resource depletion equations, and you can make very specific quantitative predictions about the data we should observe that go beyond, oh, we should just see better memory after this or worse memory after this. We can fit the data to memory experiments and see, and especially that comes to the interactions between the sequential study effects and presentation rate, because it's not trivial to see that the effect decreases at a specific proportion over timescales and lags, because we typically fit the data to just the difference between high and low frequency words, and then all of these modeling simulations I've shown, the fit of the model comes out as a bonus, as a byproduct. So I guess my major point here is that our conception is a specific mathematical equation implemented into an existing successful model of memory that can provide a quantitative rather than a verbal fit. When it goes to your first point, so the ego depletion literature has been criticized for failing to replicate many of the effects that they show. And one of the biggest problem there is that they typically employ between subject experiments with very few trials. It's usually, a typical example is that people are asked to do demanding working memory task, and then they're put in a room with sweets to wait, and they measure whether people take the sweets or refrain from it. So this is one observation per condition that varies between different people. So all of the simulations that I've shown, even though I talk about, let's look at memory for this specific item xk, the data represents an average of looking at every single item in the study sequence. So if we go back to this example here on the bottom, even though I talk about, let's look at memory for item xk as a function of the preceding item, we look at every item as a function of the preceding item. So for each participant, we gather an enormous amount of data and observations. And even though the effects are pretty small, we're talking about several percent, less than 10 in most of these cases, the overwhelming amount of data that we gather for each of these tasks gives us much more power to detect these differences relative to the typical ego depletion experiment.
Perfect. That's great. Thanks very much. That's all I have.
Marlene, would you like to go next? Marlene, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You should be able to hear and see me.
Yes.
And I will make myself seen too. Okay.
Okay. Congrats, Ven, on a really excellent talk. You will not be surprised by the question that I have. It's basically the same question that I ask every time, just in a slightly different format. And it bears resemblances to the questions that Marc has already asked you. My primary question has to do with the biological or physiological translation of some of the concepts that you have raised. So you gave some kind of explanation in terms of aerobic and anaerobic, as though these resources were a metabolic property, some kind of pool that gets depleted. And so my first question is whether that really is the right form of physiological implementation and feasibility. And more generally, my question is, what determines the relevant parameters and constraints on this resource? What might give rise to individual differences in the scale of these resources? Why do you have a value like 5.3 seconds? And could you have anticipated this a priori? And is there any physiological, neurobiological significance for this? So I'm kind of like a one-trick pony. Do the same trick over and over again, and this is my usual trick.
Well, it's an excellent trick. So the honest question is, I don't know. But of course I can speculate and think out loud about the possibilities. So there are multiple ways we can think on a biological level as to what this resource might be. On one level, we could think of it, as you said, as a metabolic property, and we could think of the analogy about muscle fatigue and ATP as a fuel as being more than an analogy, as being the same situation here. So I've recently read an excellent paper that looked at maternal mitochondria and individual differences in cognition. And there are a lot of data to show that the state of mitochondria might explain individual differences and inheritability in working memory capacity, processing speed, etc. So neurons are cells like any other cell in the body that have mitochondria in them that generate ATP molecules that require for fueling the operations of the neuron. So it might be something as simple as firing of neurons requires these ATP molecules, and we've applied this to a memory task, but it might be something much more general about neural processing. However, we have no data one way or another to say whether that is the case. Whether we could predict that based on prior knowledge about how metabolic resource recovery works, I honestly don't know. And it's a little more complicated because at least when it comes to muscle contraction and ATP generation, which mechanism will be used for ATP generation depends on the intensity of the exercise. As you increase the intensity of the exercise, you switch from aerobic to anaerobic and then to the third mechanism, and each of these mechanisms recover ATP at different rates. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that it's a different metabolic property that has to do, rather than neuronal firing, with synaptic transmission, and have to do with the reuptake with dopamine or other neurotransmitters. And a third possibility is that it's a higher level emerging property of neuroprocessing. So if we think of memory network as an attractor state in which retrieval information leads memory to settle into one attractor state versus another, the recovery mechanism might have something to do with how long it takes for that attractor state to reset and to be able to now do novel operations. But this is just a speculation on my part entirely. So these are three possibilities that I can immediately think of. It might be and even yet another emergent property of neuroprocessing that I haven't thought or considered about.
So two quick responses. My first one is, I wasn't specifically looking for an answer at the level of the Krebs cycle. That's a really big range to span from kind of complex cognition all the way to, you know, the Krebs cycle itself. So something more in the range of circuits, systems, neuroscience, and you raised some issues related to neural firing, for example.
Yeah.
One comment that I do have, though, is that these parameters seem not to be a property of all of cortex. So, for example, visual neurons fire at really high rates and in a very sustained way. And so they don't suffer from these kinds of limitations. So kind of that's one question that I have about differential explanations, perhaps. And the other quick point is, I'm wondering if you argue in terms of the attractor state, why aren't you implementing an attractor state directly?
So let's start with the second part. That's an excellent next step to pursue. So in the particular case, we have worked with the SAC model to model these memory tasks at a more localist, abstract level. And it's something that I say in the dissertation task is, so even though, so if I go back to the model representations, even though we assume that for simplicity, information is represented as these abstract unit level chunks, which I think we're right here.
Sorry to make you go through all of
this. No problem. We can use this. So even though this, so we consider this as an atom of the memory network. So even though we consider this as a singular atom that only have several properties such as base level strength and current activation, etc., it's not only perfectly possible, but it has to have some underlying distributed representation that correspond to this node in memory. It doesn't have to be an attractor state. It could be another form of network storage. It could be a convolutional network, etc. This is a step that we haven't yet gotten to, but potentially implementing it as a distributed representation could also help us look at further steps, whether any of these effects differ as other features of the stimuli, such as differential feature overlap, etc., between the stimuli affects these resources. So for example, if we go with the idea of an attractor network and how much time it takes to reset from one state to another, one prediction would come out that if the words in a sequence have more feature overlap, these effects should decrease because the attractor states that they need to be read would be closer to one another. Yep. I hadn't actually thought about this until this very moment, but I think that's an excellent prediction that we could look out in the future.
Good. Okay, maybe you could just address quickly before we move on to the next question person about things like the hiring rates displayed by visual neurons and how they're sustained and how they may be differential parameters in different parts of cortex.
Okay. My knowledge of the visual system is not as good as that of the memory system.
Yeah.
And so most of my work is on the cognitive level. So if I would start to address that question, I would first try to see whether the behavioral effects that we've looked in memory also occur with purely perceptual tasks that do not include mnemonic effect. If we don't see any effects there, that might be evidence that the visual system does not have the same problem, and would suggest that whatever the recovery mechanism is not on a basic metabolical level, because the neurons themselves don't differ much. It's the organizational structure that changes as we go up to the cognitive hierarchy.
Okay, fair enough. Good. Okay, I think I'm done.
All right, great. All right, John? John Anderson?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay, so good work, Ven. I don't really have anything to ask you, but I'm supposed to ask you something, so I'll come up with a question. And it's about the sort of basically the depletion and the recovery process. Kind of an alternative mechanism that I think would account for a lot of the things. I should say, by the way, it's not that I don't believe it, but I'm just not sure that it's easy to discriminate from alternate explanations. Is the idea that essentially these depleting events are ongoing and they continue during the item being processed. And so the reason, what we think of as the resources being depleted is the ongoing, the continuing event taking away resources from the item it should be focused on. So in one of your studies, at least, you used kind of divided attention and rehearsal as ways of trying to prevent any kind of overt rehearsal process, which is, I think, the most obvious version of an ongoing process that should produce interference. I'm not entirely convinced that that prevents rehearsal, but in any case, these ongoing processes need not be processes that are subject to conscious control. It could be the case that when you study some item, you've sort of set some memory processes off and they're going to run and they're going to sort of occupy the memory system until they're done. And so, and if you essentially charge a more expensive memory task to it, they'll stay along more and therefore, in some sense, block access or deplete access to the current process. So it need not be that something's recovering. It's maybe something hasn't yet finished up. Would be the alternative explanation.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So I'll try to address it in two different ways. So in part of your question, you said that it depends on the nature of that ongoing process. So based on the experiments we've done, we can rule out at least two different versions of that hypothesis, although not all of the versions that you mentioned. So in the experiment that we performed with the directed forgetting task, I mentioned it briefly, but I can mention more about it, is that so the two different versions that we considered as alternative explanations in that task were that So you have the preceding item xk minus 1, you're told you have to remember it, and then the next item appears. So you mentioned one of those is that you verbally continue rehearsal of the preceding item as you continue processing the current item. The way we address that possibility, so people had to listen to these numbers at a fairly high pace, and they had to repeat them out loud. So we're basing this on previous data that this type of rehearsal suppression succeeds in eliminating almost all effects that are attributed typically to verbal rehearsal, more so than repeating a nonsense syllable over and over and over again. And we see that the effect does not disappear. The alternative version that we considered is that rather than verbally rehearsing the previous word, let's say chair, you just go chair, chair, chair silently in your mind, you could just be directing your attention without any verbal component backwards and refreshing that representation. Now, that's a little bit more difficult to exclude, but the argument that we make that as you hear these digits at the same time and you have to do the parity task, it's a fairly attention demanding task. And if people, when they do that, if people attempt to direct attention backwards to previous items, then the most rational thing on that task to do would be to focus on the current item itself. But when it comes to the last version, you suggested there is some ongoing lower level process that is not within attention, is not within the possibility of directly controlling, and it just has to finish. That one is a little bit more difficult to address, but if we think about it as, so you see one item, chair, and that engages some mnemonic process that has to finish and you can't control it, it also predicts that the immediately preceding item should have an effect. But the prediction that I would make is that if you look at items further back in the sequence, the effect should steeply drop off more of as a step function, because if the item was 2 steps back, that process would complete at some point and stop and would not affect subsequent items. But we kind of see a gradual decrease of that effect of preceding items, not only to be remembered with to be forgotten tasks, but also as a different, as a function of word frequency and exposure frequency and etc. And another way to address that is that even though to be remembered and to be forgotten items, you can imagine how you engage in that process or not, depending on the cue. For when it comes to word frequency, you would have to posit that whatever that mnemonic process is, takes different amounts of time depending on the frequency of the word, which is not impossible, but would be an additional assumption that would have to be implemented. But I agree that's a fair point, and a more extensive testing of this next step would be to try to implement both assumptions in a model and see whether which one fits the data better.
Okay, well, thank you.
Okay, no more questions for John, I guess. Okay, so I guess it's my turn. So you did a great job. You have been a dream student, and I'm so pleased that the work that I always wanted to get out in a more formal way has gotten out, and you've taken it so far. I have a couple of comments. One is that we were talking, Marlene was asking about stuff at the visual level, and we're certainly not at the visual level, but it's not quite at the cognitive level. So the stuff that you joined in, was an online publication in July of 2015, the Reder et al. With the Chinese visual search. People get confused, and I've just reviewed a paper where they cited it as support for prior knowledge, helping you learn things better. But of course, there's not really any prior knowledge in these Chinese characters that are being chunked. So it's really a visual representation that's getting strengthened, and it's not so cognitive. And another example is that I used to use in my working memory, my memory class, is that I noticed my father as he got very old and was using his walker, he could no longer take steps with his walker outside and either listen to a question or answer it. So it's like the joke with Jerry Ford, he couldn't chew gum and walk at the same time. I think that working memory does in fact operate at all of these levels. It just depends on what your max is. So those, I have a bunch more little comments, but I thought I'd let you comment on those if you have any before I move on.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for bringing up that point. One problem with determining the level at which these effects happen. So I definitely agree that working memory capacity affects visual capacity, but this could be, at least the way I understood Marlene's question, is whether the depletion occurs within the level of the visual cortex. So all of these effects might happen at a later step of visual processing and some kind of a top-down effect. But I guess this is not directly relevant to your comments, but it reminded me that maybe it's relevant to Marlene's question, is that we haven't looked at it specifically, but the attentional blink phenomena does not involve a memory component and operates at the level of visual perception. I would not want to go without much in depth in it without reviewing the literature, because obviously attentional blink has been studied for a very long time, and there are very well substantiated theories and models to explain it. But that phenomenon might be relevant for looking at these effects at the level of fast visual processing.
And indeed, Kanwisher's work on a repetition blindness, I think, does fit in with our notions. Sometime maybe we can chat more about it. But in terms of when they're too close together, you don't notice that there were two repetitions. And I think that does fit with our model. But I had lots of little questions, but the only one I'm going to ask you about, I think right now, is the one I expected you to give to Marlene, but maybe you didn't get a chance. But you have these you were going to do these wonderful encore slides on ERP data, that you do have some neurophysiological stuff. So I was surprised you didn't bring them up. You've got them?
I have them as encore slides, and as you said, I was running out of time anyway. So during my dissertation proposal, I suggested to, as kind of a first way to get at what's the neural nature of this resource, is to look at whether we can replicate these behavioral effects of preceding item frequency in an ERP signal, because that would also give us some definite indication that these effects occur during encoding rather than some kind of reverse backwards effect during retrieval, which is, although difficult to imagine, might still be possible. So the reason why it's not in the dissertation and in the main slides is that the analysis are preliminary, and I wouldn't want to put them in writing just yet, but we do have some preliminary data to look at that. So one of the main findings in ERP research has been that the signal during encoding, the signal in the window of 400 to 800 milliseconds, known as the late positivity component, can predict whether you remember some item in the future, such that subsequently remembered events usually show a greater mean amplitude during encoding compared to subsequently forgotten effects. So this is just one example of this data from an original study by Polar, where in midline electrodes, you see that subsequently recalled items have better memory than subsequently unrecalled items. Now, it's currently not clear what process gives rise to this effect. One possibility is that this late positivity component reflects a differential amount of resource dedicated to the encoding process. And if that is true, we should see the sequential effects that we showed in the behavioral data also during that window, such that if the preceding study item is high frequency, it would have depleted less resources and would leave more resources for encoding the current item. So we should see a greater amplitude in this window for the current item if the preceding item is high frequency relative to low frequency. yeah, this is an example of this prediction. So this is the behavioral data that I showed in the peer study. So preceding item leads to better recall. And now we're going to look at whether if we replace recall with late positivity component amplitude during encoding, whether we would see the same effect. So I requested data from the peers study. I got data from 102 participants. It's a free recall experiment. There are usually many more experiments and sessions, but they shared this particular data set with me. So each participant had sessions, data for 4 sessions, and each session they performed a free recall task with 16 lists with 16 words presented at 3 seconds at a time on that list. And I calculated the mean late positivity component amplitude as a function of the prior item frequency. So the first plot I'm going to show is the effect on all electrodes, and then I'm going to show a summary. So here on the left, we have 42 electrodes in different panels, and the x-axis is the frequency of the preceding word. The y-axis is the LPC component during encoding of the current word. And so this was the reference electrode was the central electrode on top of the head. So polarity reverses in front and the back in anterior and posterior electrodes. And we see that across all electrodes, we do see an effect that mirrors the behavioral findings on the right in the neural data. And it's only reversed in polarity on the posterior electrodes. So if we take the mean of those electrodes reversing the posterior electrodes, we see that, oh, this is not actually the behavioral data. This is the mean voltage in that window as a function of the preceding word frequency. Another analysis I looked at, so this is done specifically for that window, but I can extract the slope of this function. I can run a regression analysis at a moving time window of 50 milliseconds across the encoding window and extract the slope for this function and plot it as a function of time to see whether the effect extends to any other time window. So in the first plot here, this is not for the effect of the preceding word frequency, but for the effect of current word frequency, just to replicate previous findings. So we have the regression coefficient on the y-axis and time since onset on the x-axis. And the black line in the center is the slope coefficient with 99% confidence intervals. And we have 6 ROIs moving from anterior frontal, parietal to parietal, occipital, and temporal. So for the current item frequency effect, the main effect we could find is on parietal regions. That we have a significant beta coefficient in 2 different regions. One is the N170, such as we have a typical familiarity effect, so smaller N170 as a function of word frequency. And we also have the N400, again, as a function of word frequency, although reversed in polarity. So now if we look at the same effect, so this was all just to show that we can replicate all their findings. So now if we look at the same plots as a function of the preceding word frequency, we again have the 6 ROIs, and especially so here it's distributed mostly at frontal and frontal central areas, and the gray bars show areas where the effect is significant.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Sorry about that.
Where the effect is significant at 99% confidence interval. So we see that effect is not only present in the 400 to 800 millisecond window that I analyzed based on prior literature, but it starts very early on, which is typically a red flag for EEG experiments because you don't expect any process to have begun. But it's not a problem.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but somebody had suggested that this was too much detail for the answer. So I apologize for asking you to go through encore. I'd like to open this up to the other faculty, and I will yield my other questions. So let me ask for anybody who, any faculty member could just speak up, or they can show their face if there's too many. Go ahead. Any faculty members want to ask questions? All right, well then let me open it up to the floor and anyone can ask a question. Okay, Lyuben.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Ven. It was a great presentation and awesome research overall. I'm not surprised at all. Awesome job.
Thank you.
So, by the way, my microphone might be, I have some software issues, so can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I have a very quick question, somewhat related to what Lynn was asking in the beginning. It's about the methodology, specifically concerning the high frequency versus low frequency word manipulation. I was just wondering, I mean, there clearly could be confounding variables when it comes to natural high frequency words. For example, typically they tend to be more concrete, more easily visualizable and so on. So, and sorry if you talked about this earlier and I missed it, but are there studies in the literature as well as things that you have considered personally about a somewhat different manipulation? For example, let's say words like a synapse or a neuron, they are quite high frequency for our community, but for the general population, they're not. And at the same time, there's other terms that aren't necessarily as concrete as natural high frequency words. So are there studies regarding this particular thing, or maybe even training people to make certain low frequency words higher frequency for them prior to the actual experiment? Are there any experiments that particularly manipulate word frequency independently of possible confounding variables? Have you considered that? Yeah, generally,
Yeah,
what do you think?
so that's a excellent question, and we have worried about that, and I can address it in several different ways. So first, Lynn has done a fabulous series of training experiments over the years. I don't have any data to show on these slides, but in some of the experiments that we've published together and previous, people have been trained on Chinese characters, that people who don't speak Mandarin and have seen them during a visual search task in either high or low frequency, and then they perform a working memory task with them and associative learning task with them. And we've found that these training studies replicate typical working memory findings. But that's an excellent question, and precisely because word frequency is typically associated with this large array of other semantic, orthographic, lexical factors. But we see all of these effects in training studies as well. One of the ones I mentioned specifically about the sequential study effects, we also looked at older data by Lynn, in which pseudo words were trained at either high or low frequency prior to the experiment, and we see the sequential effects as well there. In there, or even when you manipulate, regardless of actual word frequency, you manipulate how many times a word is repeated within the study sequence, you see that more frequently repeated words lead to better memory for the words that follow them as well. So yes, there have been training studies, and we see both for typical word frequency effects as well as for the sequential study effects that I presented in support of the recovery assumption here.
If you remember, are there any notable differences? For example, when the frequency has been artificially manipulated and the other variables are controlled, are there any notable differences in the patterns of? I mean, I understand that they're mostly the same, but is there anything that could be different? If you remember.
Not in the studies that I have looked at. When it comes to working memory in the experiments with Chinese character, we've shown that the effect of exposure frequency depends on working memory load, which is also found with typical word frequency as well. This training experiment by Lynn has showed that the typical mirror frequency effect changes as a function of training and appears later on, but not early in training. So there, as far as we can tell, based on existing training data, most of the mnemonic effect of natural word frequency can be replicated very nearly with training studies.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
So would you tell us more about the implications of this for psychological science in general? what you have found, where can it be applied? And second question, because my specialty is individual differences, and I've been impressed with this science here. We in individual differences still do basic correlations sometimes in the field of personality, which might be perceived by cognitive psychologists as
Georgie,
yes,
just I'm
yes.
sorry to interrupt. I'd
Yes.
love to have you continue to ask and other
Yes.
people here, but I'm going to
just
ask
the first question about the applications.
Yeah.
I'd
So
rather,
if
yes.
you think again about the analogy that I gave in the beginning, physiological training has changed fundamentally from the understanding how physiological resources recover during training. So knowing that cognitive resources recover in a similar way could give us insights as to how we might improve or intervene for declines in working memory over the course of a lifespan or even during the day. It might have implication for instruction, which when you're instructing someone, you have to be cognizant of the fact that presenting a large amount of difficult information in a sequence without breaks might not allow for resource recovery. And when it comes to individual differences, the question becomes now very interesting. And we know that working memory capacity differs between people and changes over the course of the lifetime. But typically that's thought of as a singular thing, working memory capacity. Here with this paradigm, we could potentially disambiguate that in two different parameters, which is total capacity versus the recovery parameter, and see whether, so I think I mentioned that earlier to one of the other questions, is as you age, which of these two actually degrades, whether it's the total capacity or the recovery grade. You could look at other different patient populations with problems with working memory capacity, and that would give you a bit more of an idea where you might intervene potentially to alleviate.
So then I'm going to let you continue after I ask the committee and any interested faculty moving to my room. So you guys can just stay and chat, but I'm going to ask Marlene and Mark and John to log into my Zoom room. Okay. Is that okay with everybody? Yeah. Thanks very much, everybody. We'll be back. For those who are still interested, stay tuned. I'm just leaving here. So sorry, you can continue. Oops.
Thank you, Lynn. So you know that in personality psychology, we know about irritability, aggression, ambition. There are different constructs or traits, we call them, and some of them might be covariates or context variables to remembering or, I don't know, reproducing the words in sequences, from what I understand in these chains. So I think just if you pair up with someone in individual differences in the future and just do a basic study with all your knowledge of this complex matter and their knowledge of the personality construct, just by correlating response times with personality traits, you might find out very interesting things.
Yeah, I agree. Individual differences are definitely excellent next step for this project. I actually want to write a grant at some point looking at these effects, because the understanding that working memory capacity is not a singular number, but could be restricted both from total capacity and recovery, opens up a large host of research questions about it. And you can find that differences in recovery rates might explain some findings, while other findings are due to total capacity as well. Yeah, you can imagine someone with having not that much capacity, but great recovery rate to be able to process information more quickly, but struggle with consuming, with integrating a lot of information presented at the same time, etc.
Sorry, Ven, you have to start over. You're not.
Oh, shoot.
5 more years.
Yeah.
Another 3 years?
Yeah. Congratulations, Dr. Popov.
Thank you.
It took us a long time. I actually had to use the facilities and Marlene had to find the room, but it didn't take us long to decide that you were pretty darn good.
But now the question is, did we pass? That's what I want to know. Did we pass?
I'll go think about it in the other room.
Congrats, Ven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Outstanding.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Fantastic work.
Great background, Mark.
I have it on hand just in case, and this is the perfect time.
Yeah, I wish we could have champagne with you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm really proud of the work Lynne and I have done, and it was a pleasure presenting it to all of you and having all of you here to join us for it and listen. And thanks for the excellent questions and discussion, not only today, but throughout the last few years working on this project. Certainly wouldn't have existed and be as rigorous as possible without all of you. Thank you.